I'd like to call the hearing to order. First, for the benefit of all my colleagues, the screen behind me is not to show my latest home movies. It cannot be raised. It is stuck there, but there will be no films presented today. I know you're disappointed, but I apologize. And also, as I think everyone recognizes, Senator Inhofe cannot join us today. He will be here as soon as he recovers. Good morning. The committee meets today to receive the testimony on the global security challenges for the United States. This hearing comes at a critical moment as Russia continues its unprovoked and illegal attack on Ukraine. I'd like to welcome and thank the expert witnesses before us today. Ms. Heather Conley is president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She brings decades of experience working at the intersection of European and Russian geopolitics and U.S. policy, including senior roles at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Department of State. Mr. Roger Zakheim is director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. He is an expert on U.S. defense strategy, having served as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee. He also served on the 2018 National Defense Strategy Commission, as well as in various other national security leadership roles. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Michelle Flonoy, who was originally scheduled to testify, but a conflict prevented her from appearing today. In fact, she was asked by the administration to join a group of dignitaries to visit Taiwan, and she is there at this moment. She has, however, graciously submitted written testimony for the record. I encourage all of my colleagues to review her insightful remarks. Our objective today is to discuss the national security challenges that this committee should consider as we prepare the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. I will turn to these wide-ranging challenges in a moment, but we must start by addressing the criminal war Vladimir Putin is waging in Ukraine. Let there be no doubt this committee unequivocally condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Putin's unprovoked aggression is inflicting untold suffering upon innocent civilians in Ukraine, threatening European security and causing serious consequences for the global economy. Putin alone is responsible for the bloodshed he has caused, and we urge him to cease hostilities and pull back his troops. However, if Putin thought his war would weaken NATO and the international community, he is badly mistaken. The United States and our allies around the globe have rallied together in a way not seen in generations. We are in lockstep with our partners, and the economic actions we have levied against Russia are already having significant impact. The world is witnessing a momentous shift in the international order, with a formidable array of global partners joining in solidarity to impose severe sanctions on Russia and provide support to Ukraine. We cannot overstate the scale and importance of this unity. As we speak, China is watching how the democratic nations of the world respond to Russia. In considering a potential invasion of Taiwan, President Xi is scrutinizing Putin's playbook and the international response. I suspect he may not like what he sees. The international community has shown unprecedented resolve, and as the German Marshall Fund's Bonnie Glaser recently said, we could make China feel very, very uncomfortable and perhaps rethink the advantages of being close to Moscow. With that in mind, I would ask our witnesses to help place the current Ukraine crisis in the larger context of the evolving international order and long-term strategic competition, as well as the implications for the U.S. approach to security in the European theater going forward. As we consider these broad questions, I would highlight the importance of the coming months for the Department of Defense. The Biden administration will soon release a number of key planning documents, including the 2022 National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the fiscal year 23 presidential budget request. The policies outlined in these papers will shape how the Defense Department prioritizes its effort for years to come. Above all else, we have an opportunity to focus on the critical technologies needed to modernize our forces and maintain our competitive advantage, like artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing, biotechnology, robotics, and hypersonics. As Ms. Flonoy wrote in her prepared testimony, we are in a military technological race with China, And what we do in the next 5 years will do much to determine whether we can successfully deter and defeat their aggression over the next 50. This urgent reality should push us into finding ways to achieve maximum efficiency in our budgeting and acquisition decisions, to effectively modernize and maintain its technological edge. The Defense Department must be able to rapidly adapt new operational concepts, operate jointly, streamline research and development of new technologies, and improve management. All too often, these efforts are stymied by the so-called valley of death in the acquisition process. Congress must demonstrate leadership in transforming how the Department achieves agility, speed, and scale. Simultaneously, we have to stay focused on the big picture. The Defense Department has appropriately identified the Indo-Pacific as its priority theater and China as the pacing threat for the United States military. In addition to its economic and socio-political growth, China has studied the United States' way of war and focused on offsetting our advantages by investing in disruptive technologies. Beijing has made concerning progress in this regard. However, there's a broad consensus that our comparative advantage over China is our network of partners and allies in the region and globally. Strengthening that network would be at the center of any strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, and maturation of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, involving the United States, Japan, India, and Australia presents a strategic opportunity to establish a durable framework. Finally, to prepare for the security challenges going forward, we must also examine and learn from the lessons of the last 20 years. In the post-Afghanistan period, our security strategy must also address the counterterrorism threat in a balanced and efficient manner so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. We live in a complex and dangerous global security environment, from Russia's aggression in Europe to China's influence in the Indo-Pacific to countless other malign actors around the world. Prevailing in this environment will require resolute, thoughtful strategies, and I look forward to our witnesses' insights into these issues, and I thank them again for their participation. As I mentioned before, Ranking Member Inhofe is not able to be with us today, so I asked his statement be submitted in the record. Without objection, it is. With that, let me recognize her statement, Ms. Conley. Thank you, Ms. Conley.
Chairman Reed, members of this committee, thank you so much for holding this hearing now. As a 40-mile convoy of Russian tanks and supply vessels are beginning to ascend on Kyiv, encircling it, as we've seen the indiscriminate bombing of the second largest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv, and also attacks on Mariupol. As we see a dramatic, not shift, but intensification of Russian tactics, and as we hear reports that Belarus may have joined this conflict as of today, we have to hold this strategic moment in our minds. As president of the German Marshall Fund, I also represent the powerful voices of our civil society grantees, our fellows, and the members of our staff who have family members and loved ones in Ukraine. Many of these courageous people have remained in Ukraine and continued their important democratic work. I have to honor their courage and their commitment today by lifting this testimony up to them. This conflict is a strategic turning point for the United States and its allies in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. It's certainly been a significant turning point for our European allies, as our German colleagues have described the transformation of German policy, ripping to shreds decades of German policy regarding defensive capabilities, sending defensive weapons to Ukraine, and their energy policy. But 20 days before Russia reinvaded Ukraine, there was an equally significant turning point, and this was the statement by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, which was supportive of removing U.S. presence in both Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And although Beijing's discomfort grows, as Chairman Reed noted, with Russia's violations of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, make no mistake, these two adversaries continue to dynamically align. So a defining strategic moment requires clarity of purpose, clarity of principles, and our strategy, of course, must support these principles, purposes, and objectives. For far too long, our purpose has not been clear, and we have confused tactics with purpose. So let me offer just 3 brief reflections. First, the national security strategy has typically implied, although noting we have 2 peer military competitors, that we really only have one, and that is China. But as I noted, we now must develop a Sino-Russian strategy. Our response to the war in Ukraine is wholly instructive for Beijing regarding Taiwan, albeit under different legal circumstances. This requires a very different strategy, one that must articulate across multiple domains, space, cyber, as well as regions. Think about the Arctic.
Ma'am, can you pull your mic closer to you?
Sure, of course.
Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, my goodness. That's so helpful. Over the last several days, our European allies have done a literal 180. And the U.S. needs to lean in very significantly with investments in our allied capabilities. This is not in order to support our European allies, in order for us to perhaps leave the transatlantic space and focus on the Indo-Pacific. This is a moment for us to lean in and help modernize European defense capabilities so that they can be much stronger and much more robust. NATO has never been so united, and so now we need to push NATO and its strategic concept, which will be developed later this year, to think more deeply about NATO's partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, just as our Indo-Pacific partners are now supporting European efforts in regards to the Ukraine war. And finally, this may not be the remit of this committee, but it is, I think, part of our national security strategy to rid the United States and our allies of malign Chinese and Russian influence. Again, we have seen a dramatic turning point where finally the United Kingdom is getting serious about ridding Russian influence in the United Kingdom, wealth, real estate, assets, bank accounts. We must push this wealth and this malign influence back to Russia. And finally, we must prepare ourselves for the images that we have and will continue to see in Ukraine. We must continue to flow immediately defensive equipment to Ukraine, provide them with actionable intelligence, provide humanitarian support, and strengthen NATO's defense posture, and give the Ukrainians the promise of a better future that they are dying for today. And by doing so, we may remember what our own purpose and power stand for, which is also in the preamble of the NATO treaty, to safeguard freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Conley. Mr. Zakheim, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today on global security challenges and strategy. I ask that my written testimony be submitted for the record. Russia's military invasion of Ukraine and the failure of deterrence in Europe more broadly makes it clear that we need a bolder national defense strategy with more aggressive implementation so we avoid losing more ground in this era of great power competition. To regain our footing strategically today and to best prepare our military for tomorrow, I recommend the following steps. Number one, adopt a national security strategy and defense strategy that competes with China as well as Russia. Two, we need a more robust defense budget. Three, we need to roll back Russian aggression in Ukraine. And four, we need to make strategic choices that reinforce those priorities. We need a national security strategy and defense strategy that advances U.S. leadership in the world by competing with China while at the same time credibly deterring adventurism and aggression in Europe and the Middle East. Our defense strategy must have a force planning construct that would simultaneously prevail in a conflict with China while deterring Russia. And that strategy must extend also to the Middle East, where deterring Iran and countering terrorism remain a national interest. The war in Iran and Ukraine is the latest real-world event that demonstrates we need to make a robust investment in our military with 5% real growth year over year to our defense budget. Chinese military modernization, both conventional and nuclear, already necessitated sustained real growth in the U.S. defense budget in the near term. Now, this committee has heard a lot about the 3 to 5% real growth recommendation that's been out there for a number of years. Today, I just want to emphasize the real part of the real 5% growth. That is to say, with inflation currently approaching 8%, the buying power of the Department of Defense has already been severely undermined and diminished. We need real growth in the defense budget. Now, this committee has also received testimony on the necessity of investments in game-changing technologies. Chairman Reid just hit upon those. I associate myself with those recommendations. Yet Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made it abundantly clear conventional forces still matter. Ships, submarines, tanks, fighter aircraft, and end strength cannot be sacrificed in favor of a future capability that exists only on a PowerPoint slide. Now is the moment to end the continuing resolution. Now is the moment to push through a robust defense budget. Now, our strategy, as my colleague just alluded to, must account for the growing coordination between Russia and China in what is an emerging axis between the two countries. Therefore, we must respond wisely and decisively to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, my written testimony made a number of concrete recommendations. I just want to focus on two here right now, one that I don't believe has received enough emphasis and is within the purview of this committee, and that is Title 50 covert support of the Ukrainians. Now, the committee members might not be able to comment on it, but I think two areas that must be an area of focus for this Congress and emphasis of this administration is, first, our Title 50 capabilities should help ensure the delivery of those weapons that will be key for the Ukrainians to defend themselves and fight for their freedom. That is, it shouldn't just end on the border with Ukraine, but it actually should support within Ukraine. Second, with this convoy, as Ms. Conley just referred to, approaching Kiev with a civilian massacre before us, we must take action to prevent that convoy from reaching Kiev. There are capabilities within our intelligence community and more broadly our national security community. We ought to be pushing for that through the right channels. Now, one other element that's important to point out is that the Russia-NATO Founding Act is now null and void. That is a 1970 agreement, NATO 1997 agreement. NATO should not be bound by commitments made during a bygone era, including stationing of major combat forces in the territory of new member states. NATO must develop and deploy conventional intermediate-range missiles in Europe and not forgo the right to deploy nuclear warheads on those missiles in the future. If the United States and its allies reestablish deterrence in Europe, it will strengthen our ability to deter Chinese aggression in the Pacific, including Taiwan. Deterrence by denial is a sound approach and worthy of investment. Not meeting this requirement will only invite more such aggression and expansion by the Chinese Communist Party outside and beyond the first island chain. Now, there are some who fear foreign entanglements and argue against policies that would strengthen our alliance in Europe or the Indo-Pacific that support Ukraine or Taiwan. However, the peace achieved through such accommodation will result in less economic freedom and opportunity for the United States and ultimately less political freedom for all people all over the world. Simply put, it will result in a false peace that will eventually undermine our national interests. In 1986, President Reagan explained, quote, "Peace is more than just the absence of war. True peace is justice. True peace is freedom. And true peace dictates the recognition of human rights." The great challenge for this next national security and defense strategy is to develop a serious, clear pathway to realizing this peace. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Mrs. Eckheim and Ms. Conley, for your excellent testimony. Starting with Ms. Conley, how significant is this shift that we've witnessed in the last literally 2 weeks? The incredible movement to NATO to stand with Ukraine, countries like Switzerland abandoning their fabled neutrality to support sanctions. Is this something that will erode over time, or will it be the new order, the new arrangement?
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I believe this is a significant turning point. This is going to be a new normal. The scales have fallen from many European eyes, whether it was a state of denial, trauma from the 20th century to think that this could not happen again. It has happened, and as we all are watching this on our television screens and on our phones, it is very personal. There are loved ones and family members they are receiving daily requests for support. So this has transformed Europe. But despite these extraordinary announcements that we are seeing, Turkey announcing it will block Russian warships through the Bosphorus. You mentioned Switzerland, Sweden, and Finland providing defensive capabilities to Ukraine. this is where, as to my opening statement, this is exactly where the United States has to lean in and seize this moment. Because while these are dramatic statements, particularly the German government's dramatic change of policy, then it becomes the hard part. It has to be executed. It has to be implemented. We have to make sure that Germany modernizes its defense to provide the capabilities and the interoperability that NATO needs. Now we lean in with our partners and allies to make sure there's no rollback, to make sure they implement and they execute that. So it is such a significant moment, but we can't just bask in that moment. We have to lean in and get greater purpose and focus. And as I said, right now, Europe understands the stakes. Its own freedoms and security are at stake, as well as ours. So I think it is a moment to be seized.
Mrs. Ackheim, your comments in terms of this situation, this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd be a little more pessimistic than my colleague. The moment is a crisis because deterrence has failed, and any show of unity that NATO has demonstrated since the crisis was unity that arrived too late, in my judgment. We can only take comfort in this unity if it results in the Russian rollback and forces out of Ukraine. Until that time, there is nothing really to celebrate or applaud. There's only work to be done.
Thank you. And in your comments, you spoke about a growing defense top line. But I think you would recognize that the top line is not the only measure. It's not only how much you're buying, it's what you're buying. And we have to take some steps to make the department more efficient. Do you have any kind of suggestions as to how we can be more efficient in spending additional dollars?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I do believe that we need real growth in the defense budget, and that delivers deterrence in its own right. How we allocate those resources, my written testimony addresses this, still requires tough choices, to which, Senator, you allude to. Husbanding forces from the Middle East, for example, the CENTCOM region being less reliant on high-end capabilities and pushing those capabilities to Indo-Pacific is a key area. I wouldn't call it an efficiency, but it's an area that is necessary to really deal with the challenges of Indo-Pacific in a fashion we haven't done since our strategy was put in place in 2018. But the resources required to address one major power and deter a second are significant, and 5% real growth, to me, is the very least we need to realize that, even if we were to realize some of the efficiencies I just referenced, I know you work on at the committee, Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ackheim. And we, in my remaining few seconds, that the key element in our response has been sanctions. And quickly, Ms. Conley and Mr. Ackheim, if you may comment on your perspective on the sanctions, their utility and their ultimate or success or otherwise.
Mr. Chairman, the sanctions that have been imposed over the last several days, the financial sanctions, particularly the actions against the Russian central bank, have been the most effective to date in realizing the true costs, economic costs to Russia of their acts in Ukraine. Clearly, we are going to see more atrocities, and so we are going to have to continue to think about completely banning SWIFT, which some are, certainly eager to call for if this does not stop. We're going to have to continue to painfully drain bank accounts of oligarchs, continue to focus on family members to make sure that inner circle feels as much pain as possible. We have to go further, but they have been effective. To Roger's point, much of this is late. It's extremely late, but it's at least arriving now. Now we just have to make sure that Ukraine can survive every day to keep fighting.
Mr. Ackheim, quickly.
I'll be quick, Chairman. The measure of the sanctions, the effect of the sanctions, if it changes Putin's behavior. To date, that hasn't happened, and until we see a change in that behavior, we should ratchet it up.
Thank you very much. Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your excellent testimony. Mr. Ackheim, in 2021, the Armed Services Committee rejected the White House's budget request. We added another $25 billion on top of the President's $715 billion request. At this point, that figure does not represent 5% real growth, does it?
It does not.
And if there's a 7% inflation, we have to take that into account and basically do 5% on top of the inflation number to get where we need to go in future years. Is that correct?
That's my recommendation, Senator.
Now, Mr. Zakheim, I am intrigued by what you said in your testimony about Title 50 covert support for Ukrainians, particularly with regard to this convoy that's bearing down on major cities. Would you explain that to me and to the members of this committee?
Senator, I think there are good reasons why Title 10 forces should not be on the ground in Ukraine. It's clearly the stated policy of this administration. But as this committee knows, the U.S. national security agencies have capability to operate outside of the Title 10 construct. With convoys marching toward Kiev, we know what Vladimir Putin is planning to do. The United States, our intelligence agencies have an opportunity to thwart or to at least arrest the advance of that column. And it would strike me as an important operational action that could have strategic implication.
Well, can you be more specific?
Well, specifically, there are, in this setting, not that I've been briefed on any classified operation plan, but just familiar with those capabilities, there are forces that could work by, way, and through to take out the roads that ultimately would lead to Kiev. There aren't so many of them, and that's what the Russian forces, that convoy is on right now. That would be a discrete, concrete action that could be taken. Of course, I also was referring to a more long-standing set of operations that would help ensure delivery of those key anti-aircraft and anti-tank capabilities that would need to be delivered into Ukraine that could get stuck at the border without that support.
How more efficiently could we get that weaponry delivered, sir?
Well, special operations capability in the Title 10 side, as this committee knows well and has supported the training operations of those forces, could absolutely deliver capability. My understanding is that the training that our Special Operations Forces has delivered to Ukrainian forces has been quite effective to date and explains why the Ukrainians have been able to thwart Russian advances to date.
Are we going to be able to keep up with the military weaponry needs of the Ukrainian forces?
Senator, I'm reading the public press, and I've been looking at it really for over a year now, and we missed opportunities to provide those weapons to the Ukrainians early on. We sat on requests, that is, the administration sat on requests from March through August. That was the first tranche. Another request we sat on until December of this year. And now, of course, it's much harder to deliver those weapons. I think this committee is in a great position to make sure that we are producing those capabilities, getting those requests approved through the committees here and the Foreign Relations Committee, and ensuring that the administration can deliver that support and get those approvals through Washington.
Hard to believe we sat on those requests. When you say conventional weapons still matter, does that include Coast Guard shipbuilding, Navy shipbuilding?
Yes, Senator.
Ms. Connolly, with regard to providing actionable intelligence to our friends in Ukraine, is it your impression that we are providing the Ukrainians with actionable intelligence in real time as soon as our intel officials receive it?
Senator, I do not know, I'm not privy to the classified information of what we're providing. All I can hope is that we are providing as much detailed intelligence as we can to Ukrainian forces so they can be as effective as possible in defending themselves against Russian attack. I'm sure there are legal and hurdles and challenges to that. I hope those hurdles, if they are there, can be quickly overcome.
Why do you think the decision makers sat on the request that Mr. Zakheim was talking about with regard to making weaponry available to our friends?
I believe there was, in some ways, we were self-deterring. We were concerned about escalating a crisis. And we thought the best way to prevent that escalation was to not give Russia any excuse. In hindsight, that was not correct. We needed to provide Ukraine with all the defensive capabilities necessary for it to defend its country. This does not mean the United States is sending forces, but we are giving the Ukrainian government the ability to defend themselves. we were playing by diplomatic rules that Mr. Putin didn't play by. And there's reasons why you go through those rules to give him opportunity. But again, as we read Vladimir Putin's intentions now, the delay was not advisable. But we are where we are now. And we have to now increase and provide those capabilities. I worry when President Zelensky tells us that in 5 days he will run out of ammunition. I worry that this will be over before we can supply that intelligence and that equipment. This is why we must act now.
Thank you both for some very important testimony.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Rono, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for your testimony regarding what more we should be doing or could be doing to support Ukraine. Very briefly, for both of you, President Zelensky has called for a no-fly zone to push back on Russia and Ukraine, especially as Russia is now using cluster bombs to target civilian populations. From your perspective, what options exist to support Ukraine's request to help them push back Russia and gain air superiority, knowing full well that enforcing a no-fly zone could result in NATO forces, U.S. forces directly engaging with Russia?
Thank you, Senator. I think we just agreed here. I'll go first because my colleague deferred. Senator, I would have liked a no-fly zone about a week ago, before Russia owned the airspace, before it became a semi-permissive environment to a non-permissive environment. At this point, it is going to take a lot of effort to fight, whether it's NATO assets through or U.S. assets through, and will not necessarily result in strategic outcome that I think we want to realize. I think that we'd be better suited to supply the Ukrainians with fighter aircraft and allow them to combat Russian air assets over Ukraine. And we've been talking about how much NATO allies have done over the past few days. Unfortunately, I read news today that the fighter aircraft that were promised to the Ukrainians by some of our NATO allies will no longer move forward. So I think the emphasis, as I've outlined earlier in my testimony, should be on supplying the Ukrainian the aircraft and other capabilities they need to defend their territory and fight for their freedom. Senator.
You would. I think we acknowledge that for enforcement of a no-fly zone, that could result in a pretty big escalation of what is happening in Ukraine. So there is that. I want to move to an issue that directly involves how we're going to meet the strategic needs of Indo-PACOM in the area of fuel. In recent years, the U.S. has enjoyed uncontested freedom of movement around the globe. However, advances in our competitors' technologies is taking this advantage away. Previously, large reserves of pre-positioned stocks at fixed sites like we see at Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage in Hawaii and large fixed formations of troops serve the DoD well, but I think it is clear the posture of the department needs to change. So focusing on, once again, Red Hill, where there's been a tremendous concern about the fuel tanks, which endangers our aquifer on Oahu, which supplies the majority of the water needs of the people of Oahu, is leaking, and et cetera. So the Department of Defense is currently looking at ways to meet Indo-PACOM's fueling requirements that do not involve storing fuel underground at Red Hill, as I mentioned, which threatens Oahu's aquifer. What major factors do you recommend, both of you, recommend the department consider in order to find a suitable alternative to these massive fuel storage facilities?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the Indo-PACOM fuel storage requirements. I just will note I'm certainly more familiar on the Euro-Atlantic. The need for resilient petroleum reserves in multiple locations. Europe is finding itself without a strategic petroleum reserve, which is obviously now will be impactful to how Europe will address high energy prices and potential Russian cutoff of energy. This is a very important issue, but let me turn to my colleague for further elucidation.
I'll only add, I'm not familiar with the particular case, Senator, that you've raised, but I think some principles that come out of the National Defense Strategy should inform decision-making here. whether it's pre-positioned stocks or fuel or logistical support. It's quite clear as we come up with an Indo-PACOM strategy, one that competes with China, we need to distribute our forces deeper into the region and contest there. And we need to come up with logistical frameworks, Transportation Command in particular, that recognizes the distribution of forces deeper into the Pacific region. And the major hub approach, perhaps, of the previous strategy is certainly not adequate, and it raises vulnerabilities.
The Red Hill facility pretty much is the fuel facility that meets a massive amount of the Indo-PACOM's fueling needs. So I think the key here is distributing our capabilities along those lines. Each year, combatant commandants publish a list of priorities for major items in their area of responsibility, which are not funded in the president's budget, even though these priorities are critical to the mission and their AOR. At times, there is a disconnect between what the combatant commanders identify as a need and what the services procure. Last year, I supported a pilot program within the Strategic Capabilities Office focused on closing the significant capabilities through an alternative process, basically to enable our combatant commanders to have a much stronger input into acquisitions for their AOR. For both of you, do you have any recommendations for additional changes to the current structures in the DoD that would fuel the needs of our priorities theaters faster?
Senator, I don't have further recommendations.
I just think the unfunded priorities list is a very important tool for the U.S. Congress, carrying out their constitutional responsibility to raise and support armies and appropriate the military. And I think there's a place for them.
Well, it's very clear that the commanders would like a much greater voice in the priority decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rona. Senator Ernst, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here as well today. And we see that the United States is facing old challenges today as well as new ones, but our charge is consistent. We must make sure that we are protecting the American people, and that comes on two different fronts. One is that we're securing the American homeland and that we are protecting our allies and partners through various partnerships. And for the former, of course, we have sovereign borders. We would like to see energy independence. That should be our focus. And in the past few months, we have really seen the catastrophic consequences from reliance on our adversaries for energy. And clearly, domestic policies can't be untangled from other considerations when it comes to our national defense. And on the second front, we must continue to develop and establish partnerships around the globe, continually building a network of allies that will help repel our adversaries from our own borders. And again, just very glad to have you here. And so, Ms. Conley, if I could start with you. Just 5 days ago, John Kerry said, and I'm quoting, "I hope President Putin will help us stay on track with respect to what we need to do for the climate." End quote. And on that same day, President Biden exempted Russian oil and gas from sanctions, maintaining U.S. reliance while shutting down our own domestic production. Do you see this administration's focus on climate as misplaced, especially with what we're seeing right now with Ukraine? And do you see the American reliance on Russian energy as a lever of control on our foreign policy?
Senator, thank you very much. Let me sort of work backwards in your questions. I do believe the United States should now work towards removing Russian energy from our energy mix completely. This is what we're asking our European allies to highly diversify. This is not a fact that's well known to the American people. I think it's something we must urgently do. If we ask others, we should do that at home as well. The climate is going to continue to be a challenge to us. But this is the moment for focus on Ukraine. This is a moment of focus on Russia's invasion. While I have myself studied extensively the climate impacts on Russia, with 60% of all of the world's permafrost thaw climate will as wreaking havoc on Russia. If the European Union does have its own climate change policies that basically end the acceptance of fossil fuels from Russia, that will dramatically change Russia itself. So there is a climate element, but the focus and priority now must be on preserving Ukraine's independence, allowing this government to survive, and repelling Russian attack. We have to be able to be clear in that prioritization and not become distracted by other issues.
I appreciate that clarification, and I do hope the administration is listening. Mr. Zackheim, do you have any additional comments as far as energy?
I think Ms. Conley summarized it well with the end of her remarks, and I'm encouraged that companies like BP and Shell have already decided, as reported today, that they will pull out of investments in Russian energy interests.
Yeah, thank you. And as well for both of you, another situation that we are closely watching is our American citizens, those civilians that are stranded in Ukraine or Russia. And do you believe it is the responsibility of the United States government to protect its citizens overseas? And if so, do you believe the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, while Americans are still remaining in Ukraine, was a bit premature? Ms. Connolly?
So it is our absolute priority duty to protect American citizens abroad. I think in many ways the administration was excising some ghosts of the Afghanistan evacuation. And understandably, the intelligence that they were sharing did prove to be correct. This is a massive invasion of all of Ukraine. But yes, it was unfortunate that the U.S. Embassy was moved so rapidly. These are always difficult and chaotic times. I think the administration learned those painful lessons in Afghanistan, did more preparation on the border of Poland, which we are seeing today, quite frankly, which is very helpful. We're also seeing extraordinary passion and support by the Polish people of welcoming now upwards of 600,000 refugees from this crisis. But again, yes, it seemed hasty. I think, again, it was we were unfortunately fighting that last battle, and perhaps we're not able to stay a little longer and help as many Americans that we could who wanted to leave, although they were given warning to do so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. It's Senator Kane, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. I want to ask a question about alliances. I think what this has demonstrated is that one of the strongest elements of our national power is the network of alliances we built up over decades, and that's a weakness both for Russia and China, and one of the reasons they're coming together. So my first alliance question is this. President Zelensky has stated over the weekend that they would very much like to have Ukraine admitted into the EU. The EU makes that decision, but should the United States support Ukrainian accession into the EU?
Senator, we should absolutely support Ukraine's strong economic relationship with the European Union, even entering the single market. The technicality of the membership may not be able to be accomplished, but they should immediately be welcomed into the EU single market. Absolutely.
Mr. Zackheim, do you agree?
Yes.
Second question on the alliance front. The U.S. does not have as formal a network of alliances in the Indo-Pacific as we do in Europe. We do have the Quad. We have the recently announced U.S., Australia, U.K. Security arrangement. There are NATO partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific. What would your recommendations be for U.S. policy in terms of assembling a more formal set of allies in the Indo-PACOM? Is that a good idea or not necessary?
Yes, Senator, I think it's an excellent idea. Of course, the challenge, as you know, is how do you do that? The Quad is a great framework to begin with. Having a leaders meeting recently demonstrated that the Quad has now taken on added importance as opposed to being in the minister level. And I think the Quad needs to take on other elements, economic, trade, and, of course, security. AUKUS was a great development that came out of this administration. It needs to deepen in meaning. It needs to be something that not only that we have cooperation on an industrial base side with the development of submarines, but also something where it's operationally meaningful. But the Quad, to me, is a place to begin to give that more granularity and purpose beyond kind of a diplomatic channel.
Ms. Connolly.
Yes, thank you. I think you've just hit the challenge that we have structurally. If we indeed see a Sino-Russian dynamic alignment is now our strategic conundrum, if you will, we need a bridging mechanism between our European and our Indo-Pacific allies. Our European allies have to be deeply embedded in our strategy for the Indo-Pacific, and our Indo-Pacific allies have to be deeply embedded into our strategy right now in Europe. We typically keep those two very siloed, and there are different experts that deal with those. We at GMF are trying to be a bridge for those communities, but more needs to be done structurally. So the European Quad needs to meet with the Indo-PACOM Quad. We need to have these mechanisms, but you are so right. Allies are our unfair advantage. We have to invest in them in the long term. And I would argue, while AUKUS was a strategically powerful instrument, how it was rolled out, the fact that the French do have an Indo-Pacific strategy, we need to bring the French, the Dutch, the German, others into this while we are leading. That's the challenge, and we have not done that yet. And I think we have to put a lot more thinking into how we do that.
Senator, may I offer just a point of contrast?
Please.
My own view is that Europe and Europeans and NATO should focus on the continent. I think events of this week and the past 5 days only reinforce that. And investment in the national defense, I made some recommendations, written testimony in terms of the salience of nuclear weapons and Europeans stepping up to the challenge. That is a priority that, frankly, has not been realized. And if we can't get Europe right first, I hesitate to distract or to add the Pacific to that.
I hear it. I have one more question. I would just say if the Atlantic 10 can have 14 teams, the Quad can have more than 4 participating nations, and I've made that point often. Final alliance question is the depth and likely future path of the 5,000-word manifesto between Xi and Putin at the start of the Beijing Olympics. I've been asking this question in Armed Services and Foreign Relations for years of now 3 administrations. Are you worried about increasing cooperation between China and Russia? And frankly, I usually kind of get blown off in that question. No, they have such historical animosity. They've been at war. They're not going to get together. I think that's naive, and I think the events of today are showing it's naive. However, they are sort of unequal partners. So just quickly, my time's almost up. What do you, in the near term, they're getting together. What do you see the likely endurance of this alliance?
I describe it as a dynamic alignment. We've the war, we've seen their cooperation in space. We've seen their military cooperation, exercising, arms sales. We will now see the economic relationship continue to grow. But Ukraine is a topic where we need to now more unpack. They feel highly uncomfortable with this violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty. We need to make them feel very uncomfortable.
By that, you mean China?
Exactly, sorry. And in some ways, we typically talk about a wedge strategy. How do we divide them? Perhaps the strategy is how do we pull them together and make China feel very, very uncomfortable with the path that it has chosen. And this demonstration of resolve of vis-a-vis Ukraine is a very powerful, instructive tool. I'll let Roger jump in here.
To me, at this point, it's absolutely demonstrating to China these are the consequences if you try something like this in Taiwan compared to what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. That's the stakes right now for this entente.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you very much. I hate to look in the past, but, the last few months we knew this was coming. I think both of you will recognize that. And Ms. Connolly, you said that we didn't do a whole lot, maybe because we didn't want to escalate this problem. We should have been in prevention. I don't know why we didn't say, listen, this is going to be your sanctions the first day you walk across that border. We should have put weapon after weapon in Poland and Romania at the beginning. Hey, this is what we got. This is what you're going to get if you cross the border. I don't understand that. So how can we learn from the past? Should we have done more the last 6 months than we've done the last week? Ms. Connolly, you go first.
Hindsight is always 20/20, Senator. I think we should have seen last April and May's military buildup on Ukraine's borders as what it was, the beginning of this conflict in many ways. When Russian Defense Minister Shoigu said that Russia was pulling back after the exercise, they didn't pull back. They were there. So yes, but I can look back in our history. We were unprepared and unwilling to go into the First World War or the Second World War. We don't typically go in quickly. We wait. We hesitate. We should have seen this, yes. We should have perhaps understood that Vladimir Putin, for the first time now, is willing to absorb enormous political cost to accomplish this. We should have seen those signals coming. We were getting used to him being a cost-effective power, meaning he uses mercenaries like Wagner. He uses disinformation, malign influence. That's cheap to great effect. This is costly to him. This is what makes this move so unusual. But in some ways, we should have picked up these signals. Alliance unity is also important to this question. And I know the administration was delaying in some ways to bring as many on board. And we're seeing the benefits of that today. But we did miss signs. And this is now not the time, in my view, for the policy postmortem. But we do need, because successive administrations have gotten this wrong. But now we have to focus totally on this moment and supporting Ukraine. I don't support going into a shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Thank you, Senator. I mean, hindsight is 20/20. We ought to look clearly at what happened and what we would not repeat doing. Conventional presence matters. We should be reinforcing more than the administration has already done with our NATO allies bordering Ukraine. Lethal force should have been delivered. It was not. We gave up the airspace. We're paying the price now. That needs to be relooked at and not allowed to repeat itself. And exercises, showing of force and how we would operate together was not done. We need to do more of that.
Well, one good thing is some of these people in NATO finally woke up because it's on their border, it's not on ours. And finally, it looks like they're going to chip in. You know, the massive missile barrage, Mr. Zackham, underscores the need for a robust missile defense, not just obviously where we're at now, but obviously, with China. Are we prepared, with the Aegis Ashore systems and, the destroyers that we have en route, are we prepared at this point, or is that what you're talking about earlier about we need to spend more money on some of these items?
Well, this is a high demand, low density capability, and you put your finger on a capability that those who worry about focusing too much in Europe because we have to focus on China and Taiwan, they'll point to exactly what this capability, air defense systems. Yes, so investment is the key to addressing the capability shortage. Of course, there's a time horizon there, and now we're in a situation where we're going to have to pick favorites. We shouldn't have been in that situation. Everybody's known the defense strategies, not just of the past administration, but before it. This was a key capability to invest in, and we simply don't have adequate ships and systems to take care of all of our interests.
Yeah, I know you're talking earlier about raising the defense budget, and we all understand that. And, the problem I've got, too, is a lot of our money goes to places that it doesn't help our war fighters. For instance, I had General Milley in there one day. He's got 400 people that work, 4,000 people that work for him. I mean, that Pentagon's way too big. I mean, we got to get people out of that Pentagon and making decisions and putting a rifle in their arms. I mean, we need to do more of preparing for the future. China is sitting around and just waiting to go into Taiwan, and we understand that. But I want to thank both of you for what you're doing. We need to speak up for more money. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We've got to spend more money. We just got Germany to spend money. I mean, that's a miracle for them to say we're going to spend, over 2% of our defense budget. We used to spend 7%. Now we're down to about 3.5%. And we've got to wake up and smell the roses, or we're not going to have any roses to smell. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. Senator King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of points I think that are important to provide some context. Until early in February, the Ukrainians themselves seemed less concerned about the possibility of invasion than we were. In fact, President Zelensky in late January was criticizing President Biden for, he said, hyping the potential invasion. And I've been in numerous hearings, both here and in the Intelligence Committee, and one of the realities was the slowness of Ukraine to respond to what has happened, or to respond to the potential of what has now occurred. Our intelligence community and the president have been very forthcoming about Russian plans and what was likely to happen, predicting it down to within a couple of days of when it actually did happen. Secondly, as of right now, according to figures that I've seen, Ukraine will be the second largest recipient of American military aid this year. It's about $1 billion as of this weekend, combined what's come in over the past year. Let me move, though, to what we could have done. Was there anything further we could have done to deter Putin? And the specific question about sanctions. Do sanctions ever work with autocrats? Because sanctions, we see, problems of the Russian economy, but Putin is still going to have his dacha and his caviar. And I remember going through this with Saddam Hussein. Do sanctions work? Do we need other tools? Bearing in mind that if the other tools are provocative military actions, when you're dealing with a paranoid like Putin, you're perhaps playing into his hands for an attack using potentially nuclear weapons, which they have a lower standard for than anybody else in the world. Mr. Zakheim, give me some thoughts.
The Senator's always very, very thoughtful comments, and it's a tough question to answer, but I don't think with someone like Putin, for the reasons you've outlined, sanctions have an immediate impact and deter or change behavior.
And he's not responsive to public opinion.
No, he puts those people in jail. So to me, I think there was more that could be done on the security side of the equation. I take your point that you want to avoid provoking and escalating in a fashion that would drive up, Putin to take the type of action you described. But I think as events have played out, it would have benefited Ukraine and the United States and NATO more broadly if we would have taken those actions. Exercises, military aid, offensive weapons, those things were all on the table, and I think would have done more to make Putin recalculate as opposed to making Putin escalate.
I think one of the problems is that he's been so isolated. He apparently doesn't tolerate people telling him the truth, and he's got to have been surprised, for example, by the level of Ukrainian resistance. Remember in the first few days he referred to his troops as peacekeepers? He thought they were going to be welcomed. And he now understands that he's dealing with a country. He's created partially a national identity and a resistance to Russia that will last for generations. Let me move from Ukraine to China for a moment. In some ways, China is a more complicated problem than Russia because we have this very complicated relationship with China involving enormous economic contacts, economic relationship. I believe we need to have some thought, similar to what President Eisenhower did in 1953, to really develop a comprehensive China strategy, to reflect upon China's history, its goals, what our goals are, how to have a strategy that certainly deals with the potential of conflict, but also deals with the possibility of avoiding conflict. I'm suggesting a solarium process. Ms. Connolly, is that something that you think we should engage in?
Well, I'm always supportive of solarium deep thinking processes. Senator, as we've suggested, I would argue, though, that the solarium needs to be a Sino-Russian solarium of understanding how those two forces are interacting as also a geostrategic challenge to the United States. In some ways, I think we do know how Beijing is, how Xi Jinping is operating. I think the solarium is understanding the entire tools of our influence and our power and our allies and how to ensure that we have a stable and peaceful Indo-Pacific. But I would argue we should widen the aperture a little bit to not get so focused on Beijing. We now have a global multi-vector challenge here.
Mr. Zakheim, I'm out of time, but quick response.
Yeah, I support it. I think the two things that have been lacking in our China strategy is where do we want to land? What do we want this to look like? What does winning look like? We know there's consensus that China's the problem. Second, we need radical management of the problem, executing against elements of strategy that we know are sound, but over years have failed to execute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cotton, please.
Thank you both for your testimony. Ms. Connolly, in response to Mr. Wicker's question about why we didn't supply more weapons earlier, you used the term, it's almost like we self-deterred. So it sounds like you're saying we didn't provide weapons to Ukraine earlier because we're afraid it might provoke Vladimir Putin to invade.
Yes, that's what I meant.
That doesn't seem so smart anymore, I would submit. Let's look at what we can do now. Mr. Zakheim used to talk about providing intelligence to allow the Ukrainian army to strike Russian troops. It could come in a lot of different forms. It could be overhead intelligence. It could be signals intelligence. It could just be a Ukrainian who's working with Americans who says, I see Russian troops sleeping in the open. Where do you think the approval authority for sharing that intelligence with the Ukrainian army should rest? Should it be close to the Ukrainian army on the front lines, or should it be at, say, the White House?
When it comes to operational matters, I would generally recommend that you delegate that authority close as you can to the operational line.
One lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan is you don't want to have what we call the 5,000-mile screwdriver operating from the White House, right?
Yes, sir.
So you don't want lawyers and professors at the National Security Council making decisions about whether we can share actionable intelligence.
As a lawyer, I would agree with that.
You mentioned BP and Shell, their commendable decisions to withdraw from their Russian oil and gas efforts. Unfortunately, we have not taken the step of sanctioning Russian oil and gas exports. I think we should do that. But two-thirds of Russian oil ships by sea. Is there anything to stop, say, the shipping companies that are moving that oil or the insurance companies that are moving those ships from refusing to carry that oil anymore?
Senator, I'm sure their customers are what's motivating their decisions.
If you were advising their corporate executives and their board about the reputational risk that caused BP and Shell to make those decisions, might you encourage them to think about stopping carrying that oil?
Yes, Senator.
I think I would too. We're isolating Russia diplomatically, financially, economically, except in Vienna, where we're still sitting down with Russian diplomats to negotiate a dangerous nuclear deal with Iran. Mr. Zakheim, what kind of signal do you think that sends to Vladimir Putin about our seriousness to isolate him in the long run?
It's a mixed message that undermines what we're trying to accomplish in Ukraine and preserve peace in Europe.
I would agree. We also are trying to help Europe find ways to diversify its energy sources away from Russia. Do you think partners in the Persian Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Kuwait, are enthusiastic about helping us solve that problem in Europe at the same time when we're negotiating with Iran to give them hundreds of billions of dollars to continue their reign of terror across the Middle East?
No, Senator, and to me, the notion that somehow we're going to rely on Iranian production to help us with energy needs fails to learn anything from the past, and specifically the immediate past in Russia.
Vladimir Putin in the past few days has engaged in nuclear saber-rattling. It's not surprising. It's a playbook that the Russians have run for decades. In the weeks ahead, we will get a nuclear posture review from this administration. What kind of signal do you think it will send to Vladimir Putin at the time he's engaged in nuclear saber-rattling if the nuclear posture review of the Biden administration reduces the investments in our nuclear modernization or some of the new weapon systems that we introduced in the last administration to deter Russia's nuclear forces?
Senator, I'm hopeful that the nuclear posture review will have a robust support policy as well as funding for the triad, as well as the type of new capabilities or reintroducing capabilities in terms of intermediate range missiles with nuclear capability. And I really hope that the Biden administration walks away from any inclination towards a no first use policy.
I'm very hopeful of that as well. We will see. We've talked a little bit about arming Ukraine on a crash emergency basis over the last few days, in some countries, last few weeks with others. Do you think we should take the lesson from this invasion of Ukraine that perhaps now is the time to substantially increase the arms that we are sending to Taiwan?
Absolutely, Senator. That is the clear takeaway from what happened in Ukraine. It's not a perfect analogy, but there's a lot to learn, including robust support for Taiwan.
Finally, Mr. Zakheim, I want to speak to you about a survey that the Reagan Institute recently conducted. I was dismayed to see there's been a double-digit collapse in the trust that Americans have in their military. It was at 70% You now register it at 45%. I know that decline has been happening for a few years. It's been somewhat gradual, though, until the last 12 months, where it seems to have substantially accelerated. What do you think are the reasons for that collapse in confidence and trust in our military, and what might be done about it?
Thank you, Senator. As you mentioned, the survey has shown this is a trend over a number of years, although it continued to decline substantially over the past year. When we asked respondents why, it tended to go to the politicization of the military, without explaining what that means. So we'll continue to work on that for the next survey. But I imagine it refers to civilian leadership and senior military leadership. When the respondents were asked to explain why they do have trust and confidence in the military generally, they talk about the troops, those in harm's way, those in the front lines.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Zackheim. It was an important study, and I do hope the Reagan Institute will continue to probe the very important question.
We will. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Carton. Senator Rosen, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed. Really important. Thank you for holding this timely hearing on global security challenges, which come as Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is just upending the international principles that sustain our peace and security. Like everyone here, I stand with the people of Ukraine in their fight against this unprovoked attack on their nation and on democracy. And, you know, Secretary of State Blinken has said that Vladimir Putin is determined to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Facing this threat, we must exhaust all tools to strengthen the security of our NATO allies now, in the future, to deter and defend against Putin's possible aggression further into Europe. So, Ms. Connolly, do you agree with Secretary Blinken's assessment that Putin's goal is to restore the Soviet Union? And so in both this and the current conflict in the future, do you think that, or do you believe that Russia will expand its aggression into NATO allies, into the Baltics, or even Poland? And what can we do to strengthen our eastern flank?
Thank you, Senator. I think what Vladimir Putin's focusing right now is the constitution of what he called in 2014 Novorossiya. It's a very focused effort on Belarus and Ukraine as the spiritual heart of a Russian empire. That is where his focus is, very specifically, not necessarily reconstituting the entire post-Soviet space to include Central Asia, although he will intervene in Central Asia to maintain regime stability. Secondly, my fear is that Mr. Putin will continue to press and challenge NATO's credibility and its Article 5 commitment. That's why NATO's posture has to be no longer one of deterrence, but one of defense. And so we have to make sure that we send the clearest message. And I think President Biden and the German Chancellor and others have been very clear, but the rhetoric has to be matched with action, that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. But he is going to challenge, he's going to press, and to see if he can get cracks into that, because that would be his greatest strategic victory of all. So we have to be very vigilant on that.
Well, thinking about cracks and pressing, I want to talk about cyber attacks, because those look for the cracks that you can't even see. And so it's really important that we know that Vladimir Putin, they've been launching malicious cyber attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure, the government networks, and banking. They've been utilizing false or disinformation to paint Ukraine as a Nazi regime. And so what more do you think the U.S. can do to help foil Russia's efforts to destabilize Ukraine through both cyber attacks and disinformation, those campaigns, using the, like I said, cyber and the media for him inside Russia and whatever he does outside? What can we do to strengthen that?
Thank you, Senator. We need to have clear policy from the United States in terms of taking cyber operations, not only allowing for defensive operations, but offensive operations, and certainly to respond in kind. The doctrine of proportionality as it applies to cyber is a complicated thing, but it's clear to me that there needs to be a response. And sometimes if you see an action coming, you take out that capability. My understanding is that the Ukrainians have been more sophisticated than those than some would have assumed, and has thwarted some of Russia's attempts to engage or use cyber operations. But NATO as a whole needs to be committed not to have policies that allow to carry out a capability that many of these countries have, and certainly that's true for the United States.
Thank you. I want to ask you, in the minute I have remaining, for both of you, are there other forms of lethal assistance that we have not previously provided Ukraine that could help the Ukrainians defend themselves against the Russians now? The convoys are moving now. We're watching them on television as we speak. Please, Ms. Connolly.
Well, it would be a bold decision to either use special forces or some means to try to stop those convoys, either from armed drones or something. It would be something that immediate that would try to be decisive and prevent those replenishments and the encirclement of Kyiv.
Senator, I think Title 50 needs to be looked at, whether it's unmanned capabilities, but to thwart, to arrest the advance of those Russian columns going into Kiev would be an operational action that would have strategic impact.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Rosen. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses. Ms. Connolly, good to see you in the Munich Security Conference. Well done there. Congratulations on your German Marshall Fund promotion. And Mr. Zackheim, keep doing a great job over at the Reagan Foundation there. Let me talk a little bit about, I think, what the broader implications are with regard to the Ukraine invasion. I think we've entered a new era of authoritarian aggression, and it's led by Russia and China's dictators who are increasingly isolated, driven by historical grievances, paranoid about their democratic neighbors, and willing to use military force to crush those neighbors, whether it's Taiwan or Ukraine, and are increasingly working together. I don't think the pre-Olympics joint statement by these two dictators has gotten the attention it deserves. Do you both agree that this is a new era, authoritarian aggression? And I believe we're going to be dealing with it for decades. What are your thoughts on this?
Senator, I agree. We see two authoritarian leaders attempting to create spheres of influence, and this will be a decade-plus process. We need to build strong and durable policies, not build to a crisis moment and then shift focus.
So let me ask about that. I think strategically there's two areas that this administration needs a massive course correction on, but I'd like both of your views, Mr. Zackheim. Number one is on the military budget. The President put forward a budget that, adjusted for inflation, was a pretty significant cut to our armed services. How do you think Xi Jinping and Putin reacted to the President of the United States cutting the defense spending for his own armed services? Do you think that was a sign of strength or weaknesses that impressed Putin and Xi?
I think it's interpreted as weakness, Senator, and weakness invites aggression.
Let me ask another question on energy. How important do you think America's energy role in the world, all of the above, oil, gas, renewables, is with regard to this new era of authoritarian aggression that we're going to be dealing with?
Senator, I think it's critical, the notion that somehow we are addressing our energy policy by increased reliance on autocrats and dictators is mind-boggling. It's a huge vulnerability, and it was an own goal, unnecessary.
So do you think Xi Jinping or Putin were impressed when this administration came in and fully, and continues to this day, I see it every day in my state of Alaska, that they came in and unilaterally started to disarm, undermine, and try to prevent, slow down, and stop the production of American energy? Again, how do you think the dictators in Beijing and Moscow view that move by the Biden administration?
Strategic opportunity, Senator, for them.
What do you think, Ms. Conlon?
So I think we have two great strengths of among many, our allies and our energy security, and now our ability to export energy, and Europe is going to be the beneficiary of that strength.
So would you be in favor, from a national security perspective, not just working families who are paying much more at the pump, to work to increase the production of American energy? By the way, we have the highest environmental standards on the planet Earth. Trust me, I know that from Alaska. In the production of American energy, would you recommend for our national security that we increase the production and not try to undermine it? Would both of you recommend that?
Yes, Senator.
Absolutely.
Let me ask one final question on Taiwan. deterrence after the fact, as we're seeing, and Mr. Zakheim, I think you already mentioned this, is really not deterrence. I think one lesson that we're already pulling out of this Ukraine situation is that the sanctions need to be ready to go prior to the invasion, not after the invasion. I have legislation that I've introduced that would, in essence, mandate massive sanctions, as big as we're seeing with regard to what's happening with Russia right now, massive sanctions against the Chinese Communist Party and key sectors of the Chinese economy, with very little discretion for the president to waive these sanctions if the Chinese Communist Party decides to militarily invade Taiwan. Would you support something like that, laying it out? Xi Jinping, here's what you're going to get if you do this. Have it pass, ready to go, so it can add a deterrent effect that we actually didn't have with regard to Ukraine. Would you care to comment on that approach to deterring a military invasion of Taiwan, both of you?
Senator, yeah, I would support that type of legislation, but also note, as we've seen in the case in Ukraine, that when an autocrat decides they're going to invade, they do it knowingly that they're going to have to pay a price economically and politically. And so it would be one component, as I'm sure you would agree, of a larger scheme of deterrence.
Senator, prepared sanctions, the clarity of that has deterrence effect. Our allies have to mirror that, and I think this has been the benefit we've seen when we've coordinated our sanctions. With Asian allies, European allies, they are very powerful. You also have to prepare for retaliation, making sure that there's solidarity funds. We see what the Lithuanians have had to endure, the Australians have had to do. We have to provide support to our allies who take courageous steps as well, so that also has to be part of the mix.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Manchin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. Thank you all for your service. I appreciate it very much. A couple of questions I wanted to ask. Basically, the Russian-China relationship. Has China kind of stand back right now watching what's going on? Have they not involved? Are they backfilling Russia at all, giving Russia the security they need, or giving them the firepower they need for the backup? Right now. Either one, both of you, real quick.
We're trying to do the who's got it.
Okay, well, I'll jump in. The answer, clear, the statement that was made before the Olympics demonstrated a commitment to back Russia.
Okay.
I think China would have preferred the Russian invasion of Ukraine to be more successful. Now they seem to be like a deer in headlights, trying to figure out how they save face from backing Russia in the way they have done. But the more strategic support is clearly going to be on how Russia handles these sanctions. And I think everybody expects China to bail them out in terms of paying for the energy.
China's to be expected to backfill Russia if need be.
No doubt, they're going to help them economically.
Ma'am, real quick, if you want to, I have other ones to go to if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest shift we saw was actually for the first time Russian forces were moved off the Chinese border to flow into, and support the Ukrainian war. That's a big, big strategic decision for Russia to do. So I think that symbolizes that this has durability. I think we have to be also very clear that the Chinese are not going to fully bail out Russia. They will strategically decide at very low cost what they can get out of this. This is what we've seen in decade-long energy negotiations with Russia. So it is not going to be, Russia is the junior partner in this endeavor. And China will protect itself from harm and get its selected interest out of it economically. But it is, again, we have to look at them both because they both share the desire of getting the United States out of both Europe and the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. The other thing, we've talked about energy and all that, and coming from a state that's pretty rich in energy, we think we can help an awful lot if they would ask us to. I've said today, I think that we should ban the amount of product we're buying from Russia to set a good example. We're buying about 600,000 barrels a day. We still have. We haven't ceased that. And do you think that would send us good signals if we could just show that we had to resolve in order to show that we were going to stop purchasing and asking the rest of the free world to stop purchasing? Because I guess these products flow in all different directions to different places. So I don't know if you think that would be good or is it going to be harmful to the Ukrainian cause?
Senator, I think it's essential we do that, and I think we have to address production and elsewhere.
Feel the same as Conley?
Agree, yes.
The other thing I would talk about hypersonic. Basically, hypersonic has been used different ways, and China and Russia has been developing them for nuclear delivery. We've been, I think, going in a direction both not delivering a nuclear, but without nuclear too. Do you think that, first of all, do you think that Russia is really sincere about thinking about using nuclear weapons in this altercation they have right now, the war they declared? They don't need a nuclear weapon to take over Ukraine, but basically to show the rest of the world that they really mean business, and when they go after somebody, they're going to face the wrath of the Russian nuclear arsenal.
Senator, they are signaling that they are willing to go in that direction. Part of that is to fear and to push off U.S. and allies, but the development and their military modernization of hypersonics needs to be taken very seriously.
Would it be used then? Would they intend to use it basically on the NATO allies that they've been trying to dissuade from bringing any other non-NATO allies into the realm? Let's say Finland and Switzerland, the Swedes and Finland, those. What's your concerns?
We have to be prepared for that escalation, Senator.
Really?
I mean, their actions require us to be prepared. The Russian approach here is obviously trying to deter and keep people out of the conflict in Ukraine in the form of support. They've succeeded already, as I mentioned before, in fighter aircraft not going to the Ukrainians. That's a saber rattling. That's their purpose.
You mentioned in your opening remarks, Mr. Zakhain, that you said we must stop that convoy from getting to Kyiv. Okay, there's only certain ways we can stop that convoy. Can you be a little bit more explicit on how we should be doing it?
I think sabotaging the roads through a Title 50 capability, unmanned or manned, is the clearest one in my mind. I'm sure there are other options.
I agree with you on the unmanned. Do we have capabilities? Do our allies have capabilities of unmanned?
I can comment on the Title 10 side that there are capabilities, and I want to explore beyond that. And I think allies as well have capabilities on the unmanned side.
You're saying it's time to use them?
Yes, Senator.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Senator Hawley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Zakhain, let me start with you, if I could. President Biden has thus far withheld sanctions against Russia's energy sector. Do you think that might have something to do with our own reliance and global reliance on Russia's energy exports?
Yes, Senator.
Do you think it was wise for this president, when he came to office, to throttle down America's energy production, to end new leases on oil and gas exploration, to cancel pipelines in this country, to permit new drilling to go forward? Do you think that was a wise geostrategic position to take?
No, Senator. If it increased reliance on Russian oil or Iranian oil, definitely not.
Do you think that the United States should allow itself now to remain dependent, increasingly dependent on Russian exports of energy, and allow our allies like Germany I think currently imports 55% of its natural gas at least from Russia? Is that a situation that we should acquiesce in, continue to acquiesce in?
No, we shouldn't rely on that, and we should encourage our allies not to either.
What about our own energy independence? Is, in your view, again, just put aside our galloping inflation in this country brought about by the president's policies, put aside the prices that Americans are paying at the gas pump every single day, just from a geostrategic point of view, shouldn't it be a priority for this country to restore our own energy independence, to become, again, a major net exporter of energy globally, and to try to become the world's major supplier, number one supplier of energy in the world? I mean, don't you think that's a geostrategic priority at this point?
It's a clear priority and interest, and one that we should pursue.
Well, I agree with you, and that's why I've introduced legislation that would roll back this administration's shutdown of our energy sector. I think it has proven to be a geostrategic disaster. We're seeing it play out before us in Ukraine. We're seeing it in the inflation that Americans are facing, and to my mind, given the confluence of events in Europe now, there's nothing that we could do that is probably more important than a combination of sanctions that would throttle down the Russian energy sector and throttle up our energy production to the fullest possible extent. Let me switch theaters for a moment with you, Mr. Zakhain, and talk about Asia, which is our pacing theater, and then about China, which is our pacing threat. The National Defense Strategy Commission, on which you served, emphasized the importance of combat credible forces deployed forward to deter enemy aggression in the Indo-Pacific. I think one of the lessons that we have to face about the latest aggression, the Russian aggression that we see in Ukraine, is that deterrence failed. I mean, we are in the midst of a massive invasion because this administration did not successfully deter Russia. We can't allow that same situation to replay itself in the Indo-Pacific with regard to Taiwan. So my question is, should we wait to support Taiwan with military and lethal aid the way that we waited back in 2014, for example, to support Ukraine until after Russia actually conducted its first invasion into Ukrainian territory? Should we wait, or should we act now with regard to Taiwan in terms of supplying vital aid?
Senator, I agree with your analysis. I don't think we should wait. I think it's not entirely analogous, Ukraine, Taiwan. I think Taiwan could do more in terms of paying for their own support and aid. But I think some of the legislation that you support here in the Senate and others in the House of Representatives are pushing forward in terms of a robust package ought to be pursued.
I'm glad you mentioned Taiwan's ability to pay. Would you agree with me? It is absolutely vital that we send the message to Taiwan that they can and must increase their own defense spending. They must invest in vital defensive capabilities, and that we can help them do that, but that we should condition our aid and help on them stepping forward to invest in those vital systems capabilities and their own military readiness.
The Taiwan needs to make an investment in their own defense. How they invest is also important, Senator. So it's not just the total dollar amount, but where they pursue those investments. So it complements a coherent strategy that can affect the deterrence that we seek and they seek.
Yeah, very good. I agree with all of that, and I think the time to act on that is now so that we can maintain a deterrent posture. Ms. Connolly, I'm running out of time, but I want to ask you in relationship to both Europe and Asia, sort of thinking about those two together. There's been a lot of discussion about European nations doing more to project power into the Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure there's no doubt that some could do more. The United Kingdom, for instance, maybe France. But in general, isn't it more important, given the current crisis in Ukraine and the crisis on the European continent, to urge our European allies to focus their military resources on Europe and to ask them to do more in Europe while we focus increasingly on the Indo-Pacific? In other words, isn't it, given the conflict that we're seeing in Europe and the great potential for conflict in Asia, that we pursue this sort of burden sharing and ask them to prioritize first their own theater and focus on that?
Well, European allies are going to concentrate on their own theater, their own protection, but the U.S. needs to be engaged in the European theater as well as in the Indo-Pacific theater, and we should then encourage our European allies to equally be engaged in the Indo-Pacific. In some ways, these two theaters are coming together. We are dealing with two authoritarians that want to establish a sphere of influence and push the United States and international law out. We have responsibility for both. We have to figure out the mechanisms of how our allies do more and we support them, not us doing it for them entirely.
Yeah, very good. And I'll end with that, Mr. Chairman. I think that last part is well said, Ms. Connolly. I agree with you. We have in this country our own limited resources. We have to prioritize. We do need partners and allies, and we've got to figure out a balance where we ask our partners and allies to do what they can do to focus on what security threats are most pressing to them. Surely for the Europeans, that is Europe right now. And we've got to maintain our own strategic focus, which is first our pacing theater, Asia, then Europe, and we've got to work with our allies and partners to meet the challenges in both, is my view. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here with us. Adding on to what Senator Hawley was saying, I think it is astounding that we are buying 600,000 barrels of oil and gas a day from Russia. Basically, this administration, because of killing the Keystone Pipeline and locking down the energy sector, they are funding Putin's war. And it is quite astounding to me that DOD does not seem to have a preemptive plan to stop some of this by supporting Russia, by supporting Ukraine in their efforts to thwart what Russia is doing. And my hope is that on a bipartisan basis, you will see more activity to stop Russia from what they are doing in Ukraine. Mr. Zakheim, I want to come to you on the nuclear proliferation issue. some of the critics of nuclear modernization talk about it being unaffordable and that we have to choose between nuclear and conventional modernization, or between nuclear modernization and addressing sustainment and readiness challenges, which seems to be kind of a false argument, a false premise to work from. So, in my opinion, but I'd like to hear from you on that view and what you see would happen if we were to forego nuclear modernization in order to concentrate on just conventional modernization, and how that would deter, what effect that would have on our adversaries.
Thank you, Senator. It would be dangerous.
Okay.
We're seeing it right now with Vladimir Putin going from a conventional conflict and then bringing in nuclear escalation by getting his nuclear forces on high alert. It is also not practical to accomplish our strategic objectives, which I've outlined as prevailing in one conflict. That is to say, a force planning construct where we want a military that can prevail in one conflict, like a China scenario, and then to deter a second
Okay,
type
let me
action.
jump
And
in
nuclear
right-
weapons help there.
Right. Let me jump in right there.
Here.
Talk about China's intentions and what they are doing as far as their nuclear arsenal and how they are trying to scale up. And if you need to submit that for the record, I would like to get your approach on that.
Well, I'm be glad to add more for the record, but Chinese military investment has been substantial. Their modernization efforts have gone along both with nuclear forces as well as conventional forces. I believe last year was somewhere around 8% growth, and that is year over year over year, and they are not saddled by continuing resolutions.
Okay, and in that regard, and looking at what I call the axis of evil, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, I had pushed to get an amendment through on the NDAA for an NPR and keeping that. So the 2022 nuclear proliferation review, do you think that is going to adequately affect the aggressiveness of China and Russia in their approach in nuclear warheads?
It's an opportunity. The NPR is an opportunity to deter Chinese and Russian adventurism if that NPR supports robust investment in the nuclear triad and does not change our nuclear declaratory policy. Those are two big ifs. We haven't seen the outcome of that report, and I encourage this committee to continue the oversight to ensure we get the right outcome with the NPR.
And then I want to return to something that Senator Rosen was discussing with cyber. And she and I have legislation that would basically have a civilian strike force that would be utilizing talent that exist within our federal system to pull together. And I've been interested to see that Ukraine is using hacktivists and an IT army. And I would like a brief comment from each of you on that regard. And Ms. Connolly, let me come to you first, and then Mr. Zakheim.
Well, Senator, I think that's an excellent idea. We've already seen the European Union send in its cyber corps into Ukraine. Ukraine has been a laboratory for over a decade of Russian cyber attacks and the implantation of malware. The more civilian capabilities we have can be very helpful. It needs to be directed, obviously, but I think that's a fantastic idea. We also have to ensure every American is practicing the best cyber hygiene because we all have a role to play in this.
We do, and Senator Blumenthal and I have legislation that would address that commercial sector. But our military and governmental sectors, we need to pop up a bit. Mr.
I would only add, I agree with Ms. Conley and support your efforts, Senator, but we need policies that allow us to use those capabilities. That has been hampering us for over a decade now, and that's where I recommend the oversight focus.
Thank you. I appreciate the
Dardanelles off is really an important step. And I think what we haven't talked about at the hearing is thinking about how we can reorient Turkey, a country I know you have spent an enormous amount of time trying to make sure it is strategically anchored towards the West. This may be a point of turning for Turkey as well in the Turkish-Russian relationship, and that should be exploited as well.
Well, can you talk about that a little more, and maybe Mr. Zakheim, you would like to add to that as well, but how should we be addressing what's happening with Turkey now, and how can we really capitalize on this moment in terms of how they're thinking about their role between East and West?
Yeah, what you see President Erdogan doing right now is trying to affect balance. And again, I think what we're going to see over the coming days is no one can affect balance between this. This is a time for decision and a time for knowing where your allies and your interests lie. It's going to be painful for Turkey, obviously. Russia will counter-retaliate on sanctions. But I actually think, again, this is a moment, and not setting aside President Erdogan's internal repression, his decisions of, lack of free speech. We can talk about that, obviously, in Poland and Hungary as well. There's some real challenges that I don't want us to lose sight of, but this is a moment for recalculating. And I think this is a conversation that needs to occur with the entire Turkish national security apparatus, not simply President Erdogan, which we've tended to concentrate that conversation solely through him. This may be an opening to see if we can now get new thinking on the S-400. Turkey and Russia are rivals, whether that's Syria, that's Libya, obviously Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Turkish drone decision even to Ukraine, I think, shifted Russian thinking here. Maybe we need to seize this opening to see how we can re-anchor Turkey towards the alliance. I'm happy to give you some additional thoughts, but those are initial.
That would be great. Thank you. Mr. Zakheim, do you have anything to add?
I would simply add that while we should exploit this opportunity to move Turkey away from Russia, we know Erdogan. We ought to be clear-eyed about it, and what we expect should be limited.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cheney. Senator Scott, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed. Well, thank both of you for being here, Mr. Zakheim. I think everyone has seen the obvious threat Communist China and Russia pose. Given their dual threat, should we continue to assume that America can have a military that is capable of only fighting a war in one region? Or do you think we should be returning to maintain a military that is capable of fighting wars in two major regions? Mr. Zakheim.
Thank you for that question, Senator. And the National Defense Strategy in 2018 was clear that we needed to be able to prevail in one major conflict and deter in a second theater. And that latter point seems to be forgotten. It is a departure from the Cold War construct of being able to carry out two MRCs. But the problem with that construct is that we never had a force capable of doing that. So this construct that came out of the last defense strategy is one that I hope the current defense strategy adopts, one that relies a lot on allies in that deterrence, increased salience of nuclear weapons, but definitely recognizes that U.S. leadership should be present in three regions of the world, that is Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East, and we should have force sized large enough to prevail in one conflict, hold another theater, and eventually swing to that second theater if a second conflict emerged.
Thank you. Mr. Zakheim, in light of the rapid expansion of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, do you believe the upcoming nuclear posture review will adequately reflect what our future nuclear posture should look like? If not, what else do you think we ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, as I had an opportunity to share before in this hearing, the NPR, I'm hopeful, will have robust support for the nuclear triad. I'm hopeful it will support investments in intermediate range nuclear missiles with the nuclear capability to put that on the table as well. And I'm hopeful our declaratory policy will not change. And no first use policy would undermine the very purpose of having a nuclear deterrent. We need extended deterrence now, Senator. That matters in the Indo-Pacific, and it matters increasingly more in Europe as well.
Why do you think deterrence failed in Europe?
I think it's failed because we've had successive administrations that have allowed Vladimir Putin to experiment and use force and invade sovereign territory of other nations. That happened in Georgia in 2008, happened in Ukraine in 2014, and he thought, and he thinks, and to date he's been proven right, he could do it without NATO and the United States responding. a more robust deterrence posture in the form of military presence, military exercises, and lethal aid to Ukraine would have done more, certainly, than what we've seen in Ukraine, and could have prevented Vladimir Putin from taking this current adventure.
Thank you. What do you think of the near-term prospects for arms control negotiations? And if Putin is failing in his attempt to reconstruct the Soviet Union, how do you think that affects his goals for such negotiations?
At this point, we should not be negotiating with Vladimir Putin in terms of arms control or anything else until he removes his forces out of Ukraine. The notion that we're going to try to negotiate with this man while he's holding Ukraine hostage is absurd.
Thank you. How successful has the Pacific Deterrence Initiative been since Congress created it? And what do you think the next steps are for our Pacific posture?
The Congress has been critical in leading a focus buildup of capabilities in the Pacific with the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. The administration, last administration, this administration has taken some of that on, but not enough, and it shouldn't rely on the Congress and this committee to do the work that it should be doing. We need more of what's in the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. It needs to be distributed and executed, and we need military concepts, operational concepts, developed so we are certain that those capabilities in PDI are actually being utilized in a coherent fashion.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott. Senator Peters, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our guests here today for your testimony. Mr. Zekheim, certainly President Putin's unprovoked and illegal attack on Ukraine's sovereignty has certainly clarified the resolve and policy of many countries around the world. It was really, in my mind, quite amazing in terms of what we saw in terms of support from democracies all across the world. In your testimony, you mentioned the significance of Germany's commitment to defense spending as one example of that. But certainly with other countries engaged, countries that in the past have been neutral, countries like Switzerland, this is certainly something unprecedented. And had we talked about this a couple weeks ago, probably wouldn't have thought it would actually happen. So it is truly amazing. My question to you is, do you believe that this shift in attitude from some of our European partners, and I think it stems from an underestimation, quite frankly, of the autocratic regimes like Putin's Russia and what they are capable of and the threat that they can present to the world order. The question is, do you think this could lead to a potential shift in attitude from some of our Indo-Pacific partners vis-a-vis relations with China? Is this something that we should be thinking about?
Senator, yes, it's an excellent question. I think we've already seen some indication that Japan is responding to Russian aggression and thinking about the implications of what China may do in the region as well. So the answer is yes. I think it's quite clear with the statement that came from Putin and Xi before the Olympics was a signal that what's happening in Europe can very well happen in the Indo-Pacific. And yes, when it comes to Japan in particular, I hope South Korea as well, and others who are sitting on the fence and trying to balance right now will be a clarifying moment for them in the same way we've seen that clarifying moment in Europe. Senator, I would just add that it doesn't help us to have this clarifying moment if Russia remains in Ukraine and Putin has his forces occupy Kiev. So the clarifying moment is only meaningful if it results in some sort of action that forces Vladimir Putin out of Ukraine.
So question is, as we go back to the Indo-Pacific and thinking about that and our partners and potential partners there, are there any policy changes that you would recommend from allies, partners, or partners that we should explore to strengthen the resolve and the readiness of countries in that region?
There are a variety of things I think we should be pushing on, a few of which we can control. The Quad, as I exchanged earlier with one of your colleagues, needs to become more than simply a diplomatic vehicle to discuss security issues. It should have a kind of security muscle that is part of it. AUKUS needs to be more meaningful than the commitment on submarines. I think former Prime Minister Abe's comments out of Japan about the self-defense forces in Japan and what they'd be willing to do via extended deterrence, for example, is something that I'm hopeful the leadership in Japan and more broadly across the Indo-Pacific will follow.
Ms. Conley, yesterday you had discussed in an interview just how significant the transformation of European policy has been as a result of President Putin's unlawful actions. My question for you is, are you aware of partnerships or programs that the U.S. armed forces should re-engage in or perhaps develop in order to make the most of this movement that we are now seeing towards collective defense? This clearly is a moment for us to take action, I believe, but what are your thoughts?
Senator, you're exactly right, and this is in my written statement, which I would also like to be placed into the record. Absolutely, this turning moment when, for example, the German government announcing a 100 billion euro special defense fund, which will be written into the basic law. That's a constitutional requirement for them to do that, reaching 2% of GDP, modernizing their nuclear sharing responsibility. This is exactly when the United States has to lean in and help Germany create a modern defense which is highly interoperable with NATO. We have our NATO allies on the eastern flank already exceeding 2% of GDP. They're buying U.S. equipment. They want that interoperability. We have to be there. We have to invest in them to make them as strong as possible. I just want to, again, highlight, I know we had an exchange with Senator Hawley. I just want to be very, very clear. This does not mean supporting our allies so we can leave. This is bigger than what our allies can handle in Russia because of our nuclear security umbrella, because of our capabilities. But we can make our allies so much more capable with strong U.S. support and engagement, just as we need our Asian allies to be strong and capable actors, perhaps having European partners if they have capacity to support that. We have to rethink this entire model of alliance investment. We haven't done it very well, quite frankly. Over the last 20 years, we're highly transactional. We obviously, there's a difference in view across our political spectrum about the value of those allies. That's the part here that we have to get really right at this strategic moment. We have to double down in alliance investment in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. We have to see how they can support one another because that is surround sound for Russia and for China. This is how we meet this challenge of our time. It's diplomacy, it's economic, it's security, it's sanction policies. If we can get this right, we can isolate Russia and China pretty profoundly, but it's going to take an enormous amount of work.
Great. Well, thank you both for your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters, and without objection, both statements of the witnesses will be included in the record. Senator Tillis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Zakim, I would like to maybe have you and maybe Ms. Conley get inside of Vladimir Putin's head and tell me what occurred. He's had a desire to invade Ukraine for decades. What changed that made him, what changed or what did he calculate to make him think that he could get away with the murder and the disaster that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine? What do you think, as he was looking at the line, being able to cross that line, what changed over the past months or years that make you feel like he thought now the time was right to do it?
Go ahead.
Mr. Zakim.
Okay. A hard place to get into, Senator, that is the mind of Vladimir Putin. But here it goes. I think he's been convinced over the past number of years, as I mentioned, since 2008, but certainly reinforced over the past year plus, that the United States, NATO more broadly, will not involve themselves in the defense of Ukraine. We made that clear by not only not providing lethal weapons, but by sitting on that support for a significant amount of time, and then NATO allies doing the same. So reading the tea leaves here wasn't difficult. He knew he can go in, and it would be a limited response from the West. Perhaps he's gotten more than he's bargained for, given the response of Germany and others. But that, I think, was the calculus, Senator.
When he was gaming out the possible response by the NATO allies, which I incidentally think is critical to our long-term security, and anyone who would question that needs to open up a history book. But when he was gaming this out, do you think that he saw Turkey taking the position that they would take? Do you think he saw Switzerland breaking a decades-old tradition of being neutral, or Sweden or Finland, or the response that we've seen from Germany and our NATO allies and partners? Do you think that was in any of his scenarios for where we would be 6 days after he invaded Ukraine? Ms. Connolly?
No, Senator, because he thought he had purchased a lot of that. And this is where, malign influence has worked. I mean, my view is the reason where Putin believes he got to where he is, lack of impunity since 2008, serious impunity. And we focus on it and then we go to the next crisis. His own isolation. And I think this is indeed a factor, and he's drunk his own historical Kool-Aid. He used that as a tool. Now he actually believes it about his legitimacy and his legacy. It speaks to what Russia is doing in Ukraine. He didn't even understand the Ukrainian people. He doesn't understand his own people. When 6,000 demonstrators come out on the street, they don't want war. They want a higher standard of living, and they want peace. He had never fathomed that Germany would make the decisions that it has, or Turkey. This is the miscalculation of his cost. And not to add another concern here, our focus must stay on Ukraine. But as many Russian analysts are saying,
I want to be
sorry.
respectful of time, but so he has caught himself up in a knot. How do we go forward from here? How do we get to a point where this is it's already a humiliation. In 5 days, he's humiliated himself. He's not making the progress he thought he would make. He underestimated the world, the free nations' response to it. Where does he go from here? What possible exit strategy could he have other than just amping up and killing more women, more children, and starving the Ukrainian people?
Oops, we're at that point.
Yeah.
He's already accelerating.
Mr. Zakim, I want to ask you a question about the 2018 NDS. You had a little bit to do with that. How would you grade the DOD and Congress's implementation?
The Department of Defense probably gets a below average grade in implementation. The Congress, I think, deserves a high grade in terms of oversight and pushing forward on it. Appropriating funds has not gone well, and so Congress has failed on that front.
What would you consider to be the top risk as associated with the less than stellar implementation of the 2018 NDS? What's the one risk that keeps you up at night?
That we have yet to figure out the operational concepts, and we have yet to invest in and deliver the capabilities we need to execute the objectives of the 2018 NDS, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. There is still no clarity on how we would fight, or the point is I think there are multiple approaches, and so no agreed-on approach. So the operational concepts are not sharp enough, and we clearly have not made the investments and the purchases we need and the deployment of those capabilities into theater where they'd have the deterrent impact today, let alone what we need for a conflict.
And as much as we are rightfully focusing on the situation in Europe right now, I think that we have to be able to show that we can walk and chew gum at the same time and address the priorities that were in the 2018 NDS. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Connolly, over the last couple of weeks now, especially in the last 5 or so days, our country, the U.S., has played a leading role in coordinating the global response to this illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And over this past weekend, we saw a lot of new measures being put into effect. And I've been pushing for, including sanctioning Putin directly, oligarchs, his family, and denying Russian banks access to the SWIFT banking system. So far we've moved in lockstep. The West has, ratcheting up sanctions gradually and by consensus. Do you think there's any risk to this approach? Namely, are there stronger measures that we could be considering right now and even consider unilaterally, if necessary, to put maximum pressure on Vladimir Putin?
Senator, I think the images, I hope I'm wrong, but I think the images we are about to see in the next 24 to 48 hours will dictate that we have to throw everything at it. That's all we can do. We have to now start sanctioning oil and gas, a complete SWIFT. That's all we can do, in addition to providing Ukraine with the defensive capabilities it needs.
Ms. Connolly, let's talk about that for a second. So the remaining banks that have not been removed from the SWIFT banking system, my understanding is, that's largely to be able to do the transactions to move oil and gas out of Russia, and especially gas to European nations. If we were to remove that ability to transfer money to Russia, essentially, in this case, because European nations are purchasing the natural gas, what would that mean for countries in Europe this winter?
Well, it would be devastating. Their energy reserves are very low. I think the only good news is we're coming out of winter, and they've had a warmer winter, and they may have enough supplies. The may part is a question mark. No, what I am saying is this will be enormous sacrifice.
Is the LNG capability there? Can we backfill some of it? I'm not even aware of how many liquefied natural gas ships there are and how many of those are available to be able to try to supply Europe with natural gas.
I don't have numbers either. The good news, bad news. Asia has filled up. They filled up their reserves. There is some spare capacity. Thankfully, Poland, Lithuania, the others were constructing LNG terminals in Croatia. Again, this is something that the U.S., previous administrations have been focusing on, energy diversification. So there are some facilities. But whether this would be enough, and whether we don't direct the molecules, the markets direct those molecules. But yes, this would have to be an heroic effort to ensure that Europe has enough energy to continue to have its economies move.
So would you be in favor of finalizing the ending of access to the SWIFT banking system from those remaining banks?
I think we have to be absolutely prepared to do that.
And do you have any ideas how we might get the Saudis to agree to pump additional crude?
That is a lot of my remit. Maybe Roger has thoughts on that.
I definitely think the Saudis are looking at the negotiations in Vienna, and they want assurances on whatever agreement the administration is dreaming up to have with Iran. And if we're not reliant on Iranian oil production and reliant on Saudi production, I'm sure that's something they'd be open to.
And do they have the capacity on the natural gas to backfill what would be lost from Russia?
Saudi?
Yeah.
I think it's going to take out their support.
You say that again?
It's going to require support from other countries.
Okay. All right, thank you. And I yield back the remainder of my time.